Putin needed a new social contract when he came back to power in 2012. And the new social contract looks like this. You let me govern with my guys, and you let us get rich. And in exchange, I will make Russia great again. We get Crimea, we get Syria, we are the spoiler for US foreign policy. We get respect.
The mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. Right. The main event is a talk by Dr. Alexandra Vacroux, who also happens to be an old friend of mine from back in the day in Moscow, and it was a day. And that's all we're saying. Anyway, so it's great to have her here. And she's spoken for us at World Boston before. As many of you know, Alexandra is executive director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and lecturer on government at Harvard. Her scholarly work addresses many Russian and Eurasian policy issues. In addition, she teaches popular courses on the comparative politics of Eurasia and post-Soviet conflict. She has mentored dozens of Harvard's best and brightest Russian regional studies students and scholars. She's an active member of the bilateral working group on the future of US-Russia relations and co-chairs the Davis Center's long-running comparative politics seminar.
Thank you everyone for coming out. I understand it's pouring rain out there. So I guess that's kind of indicative of how much Russia matters these days. And it's certainly true that you can't open your newspaper, your news feed, your Twitter feed without seeing something about Russia. And it's usually not particularly flattering, unless the president is talking about the country. But for the most part, there's a lot out there that would lead you to believe that Putin wants nothing more than to undermine American institutions, elections, and everything that we hold dear. But is that really what's happening? Is that what Putin is thinking about? Is that what's really driving Russian foreign policy? What I'm going to try and do today is give you a little bit more perspective on why Russia is doing what it's doing and what its national interests are and how it derived those national interests over the past 20 years or so. I want us to really understand what is going on in Russia as a way of understanding what is happening here as well. So we're going to explore all of these questions, but first I want to open, if I can, with the advice that Chekhov gave a young playwright about taking everything extraneous out of his writing, something I try and do in my talks as well. You'll let me know if I succeed. But he said, if you have a rifle on the wall in Act 1, it better be fired by Act 3. I'm going to provide a little bit of theater for you today. This is the Bolshoi. And the point is to go along with me for this narrative, for this story about how Russia came to be what it is today. But you have a job as well. You need to find the rifles that have been strewn about in the past 20 years by Americans and by the West in our relationships with Russia. So let me set the stage. I want to explain first where Russia is coming from, economically, historically, politically, and why that matters. We're going to get a little technical here for a second. In the 1870s, which is at the far end of the chart, you can see that Russia was among the top 5 global economies. It had 8% of global GDP. This rose, it fell a little bit after the revolution, but then it rose up, and by 1960, which is here, and Russia is here, Russia has 10% of global GDP. Now that's the peak for Russia in terms of its economic power in the world. After 1960, it starts falling, but it's really only after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses and Russia takes over as the largest regional economy, that the decline is pretty abrupt and total, and Russia's economy is now about 2% of global GDP. It's unlikely to ever be more than that. Here's another way to look a little bit more closely at the trends that we've seen since 1980. So I know this is probably not so easy to read in the back of the room. Let me explain what you're looking at. You're looking at the national share of world GDP The top country there with the star is the United States. You can see we retain about 25% of global GDP, not adjusted for prices. And the European Union is right up there with us. The next highest country is China, which has a pretty steep rise. And then there's Germany, the United Kingdom, India in the middle. But the bottom, this blue line, is Russia. Russia is always going to be at the bottom there. And yet, Russia manages to punch far above its economic weight. Why is that? Why does this not seem to matter when we're trying to understand Russian policy? Let me tell you why Russia's economy looks like that. Russia has always relied on a monoculture. That is, there was one particular sector, one form of exports that was sustaining the entire economy. In the early 1800s, that was naval stores. They were selling oak and building ships for navies around the world. By the end of the 1800s, it was wheat. Russia was one of the biggest wheat producers. In fact, it was competing with the United States to sell grain abroad. Now, it's oil and gas. And oil and gas revenues make up 80% of the Russian budget. That's an enormous dependency on one source of tax revenues. It also means that the economy is extremely vulnerable to fluctuations in commodity prices, especially in oil prices. I wish I had a rifle to fire here, but I couldn't bring it into the library. So with that, let me raise the curtain on Act 1, humiliation, the 1990s. The Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991 by the presidents of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Price controls were lifted, as was the Communist Party's monopoly on power and the state control on information. Now, in the West, when we think about the 1990s, we think of this as the golden age of Russian democracy. There was freedom of the press for the first time. There was freedom of entrepreneurship, property rights. There was movement. Russians could travel abroad for the first time freely. There was even McDonald's. We considered this a great success. But that's not how most Russians remember the 1990s, that first post-communist decade. What they remember when they think of the state and when they think of their first president are often the oligarchs, a group of 7 extremely wealthy businessmen, or biznesmenly in Russian, who parlayed their fast-earned gains into political power. And perhaps the most reviled among them was Boris Berezovsky, who represented for many the very phenomenon of state capture. If a law was opposed by these oligarchs, it could not pass. Meanwhile, Russia went from being one of the most egalitarian societies to one in which the extreme wealth of the oligarchs was paired with extreme poverty of the population. I remember, and I'm sure Mary does as well, coming out of the metro stations and finding rows of pensioners standing there selling their belongings, their kittens, their jewelry, their medals, anything to survive in the hyperinflation of the early 1990s. This is also a rifle, by the way. Meanwhile, beyond Russia's borders, NATO was attracting suitors. When you think of the USSR, it was Russia surrounded by a series of concentric circles. So closest around Russia were the 14 socialist republics, and then there was another ring around that of friendly East European countries, part of the Warsaw Pact. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Warsaw Pact also disappeared. And suddenly, everybody turned to NATO, looking for that organization to be the guarantor of Euro-Atlantic security. Even Russia wanted to join NATO, but was rebuffed. The East European countries, however, were not rebuffed. And this started to pose a great risk for Russia. In all of Russia's history, whenever it hasn't been expanding, it's been invaded. And this is a lesson that we Americans, with 2 oceans on either side of us and friendly big neighbors to the north and to the south, can't really understand. But it's extremely important in understanding the Russian mentality. The last straw for the Russians was NATO bombing of Serbia, a Russian ally and a fellow Slav. In fact, they even have the same flag as Russia. For many in Russia, this is the original sin that led to the downfall of the post-Cold War order. Even now, they talk about Kosovo all the time. And when they talk about it, they say this is the moment when we understood that great powers do what they want, and that the idea of sovereignty is only as strong as the ideas that are supported by those great powers. So when the United States and NATO decided that self-determination of Kosovars was more important than Serbian sovereignty and bombed Serbia, that was a lesson that Russia took on board and that you're going to see playback later. The epilogue for this act is a Russian expression, "Lomat ne stroit," which is to destroy is not the same as to build. Yes, the United States and the West helped to take apart some of the Soviet and communist institutions, but there was no alternative built up to take their place. And the 1990s are remembered as a period of chaos, of uncertainty, of poverty for many. And by the time we get to Act Two, many Russians were really ready for a change. So Act Two begins with the arrival of a formidable new character, Vladimir Putin. A former KGB man, he sees himself as having the task of restoring Russia, restoring the federal government's power over the 89 regions, which were doing pretty much whatever they wanted, including passing laws that contradicted federal laws, restoration of presidential authority over the oligarchs, and also over the economy. Things go well for the young prince at first. The high oil prices allow him to do massive investment in Moscow. This is Moscow City, an entirely new development that sits on the banks of the river. Some regions also do well, particularly if they have a lot of oil to export. And there's also a significant amount of social spending for the first time in 10 years. Putin also makes it clear to the oligarchs that there's a new sheriff in town. In fact, if this were a Western, this would be the point where he kicks open the doors of the saloon with his big hat and comes in saying that things are going to change. He tells the oligarchs, this is the deal. You stay out of public life, and I'll let you keep those shadily gotten gains that you got from the 1990s. Khodorkovsky, Russia's richest man, who you see in the little corner here, doesn't listen. He owned most of the Duma, actually. He was paying Duma deputies every month and had been contemplating a presidential run. And he is arrested and then sent to jail to sew mittens for 10 years. The nature of state capture, though, it's not that state capture has gone away, it's that it's changed. Now if you have a business, you're not worrying about some other businessman coming in and taking your stuff and taking over your business. Now you're worried about state bureaucrats and the people that are surrounding those in power. You're worried that they're going to come and take your stuff and take your business. Meanwhile, beyond Russia's borders, there's been a worrisome development. Populations are rising up and taking to the streets and kicking out some of those governments, or some of those leaders that have been holding on since the fall of communism. Yugoslavia in 2000, Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004, Kyrgyzstan in 2005, borrowing from what happened in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall. These populations are taking to the streets and getting rid of their old leaders and asking for change. This makes Putin really nervous because he thinks that the US and the CIA are trying to use these populations to encourage new leaders that will tilt more to the West and away from him. And he thinks that he's the ultimate target for all of these plans. The epigraph for this act comes from a 19th century Russian diplomat who said, "Russia is not sulking. She is collecting herself." The curtain rises on Act 3. Confrontation. Putin returns to the presidency in 2012 after having faking a term as prime minister, and this time he's mad as hell. The economy has recovered from the global financial crisis. Oil prices have recovered or stabilized, and all of this gives him a little more confidence that he has more flexibility, more ability to act. The 2014 Sochi Olympics were a success in terms of medals, at least at the time, but Russia is disappointed by the way that the country was treated. They didn't like the bad press that they received before the Olympics began, And they were also offended that Obama and other leaders boycotted the Olympics over a crackdown on gay rights. Russia feels disrespected. And one of the things that happens is that it suddenly and extremely effectively, without firing a shot, moves into Crimea, part of Ukraine. Now, Crimea is a very complicated situation that I won't go into here, except to say that the West is outraged by this violation of sovereignty, of Ukrainian sovereignty. The Russians hold a referendum, the Crimeans hold a referendum, and 96% vote to join the Russian Federation. And even though this was probably not the best run referendum in history, for sure, most of the Crimeans would have wanted to join Russia. It's a largely Russian-speaking population, very heavily oriented around the naval base that's there in Sevastopol. And so the Russians turn sweetly to the West and say, why are you so upset? It's just like Kosovo. Self-determination trumps sovereignty. Importantly also, the West is actually not the audience for what happens in Crimea. It's the Russians, and Putin gets exactly what he wants. If you see this big jump, that's the jump in Putin's popularity rating after the invasion of Crimea. At the same time, gallingly, Obama refers to Russia as a regional power, which is acting out of weakness, and notes that it doesn't present a leading security threat to the United States. Now, parenthetically, I'm just going to note that that popularity boost did not last. And over time, we've seen Putin's popularity trend back downwards, which might be a cause for concern. But let me go back to Obama. Obama says Russia is a regional power. What's the difference between a regional power and a great power? A great power projects power beyond its borders. Putin says, okay, you think we're a regional power? We'll show you that we're a great power. And in 2015, Russia begins airstrikes in Syria to prop up Assad. Now, you have to understand that the Russians have a fundamentally different view of geopolitics than the Americans. We believe, rather naively, the Russians would say, that the world is divided into good and evil people. And that if we can identify the good people, which we can, then we can encourage them to get rid of the bad guys, and the world will be a better place. The Russian view of the world is that it's divided into two things, order and chaos. And they are for stability, certainty, they're against regime change. And they look at this and they say, my friends, you are in the chaos business. We are not going along with that. What we see in Russia today has been called a battle between the television and the refrigerator. On the one hand, state-supported media, and that's really the only kind that's left now, maintains a steady drumbeat of anti-Western propaganda. This is a screen grab from Dima Kiselyov, who runs the Russian 60 Minutes, if you will, reminding Russians that it's the only country that could reduce the United States to a pile of radioactive ash. On the other hand, this is where the refrigerator comes in, the economy is not in great shape. And while some people in Washington might say that that's because sanctions have been so effective, in fact, what we see is that the Russian economy is almost entirely dependent on oil prices, and sanctions really have not made that much of a difference. Don't forget that monoculture rifle about being dependent on oil prices. So when you see something like this is actually fake news. The shelves are not empty in Moscow. Like they were a little bit at the beginning after sanctions, but it wasn't because of Western sanctions. It was because Russia introduced counter-sanctions blocking Western imports. And so for a while, the shelves were emptied. Since then, however, Russian producers have really stepped up and have been able to replicate or substitute a lot of the things that used to be imported, although the cheese is pretty bad. Like, don't buy the camembert, is all I can say. So where does that leave the Kremlin? When he came to power in 2000, Putin presented a type of social contract to the population. He said, look, I know you want order and stability, and I can give that to you. Just let me govern the country the way I see fit. Let me tighten the screws a little bit. Let me introduce a little bit more order, and in exchange, you will have prosperity, You will have stability, you will be allowed to travel, and things will be much better than they were in the 1990s. That contract worked pretty well in the 2000s, but it fell apart when the oil prices fell. Putin needed a new social contract when he came back to power in 2012. And the new social contract looks like this. You let me govern with my guys, and you let us get rich, and in exchange, I will make Russia great again. We get Crimea, we get Syria, we are the spoiler for US foreign policy. We get respect. And that seems to have carried him pretty far, although you'll remember that parenthetical slide I showed you that, again, the popularity seems to be coming down, in part because of unpopular pension reforms. So we have to ask ourselves, how is this going to play out now? What is going to happen? Putin still wants respect. He demands respect. And whether or not he gets what he wants depends in part on the West and on what we do. The real question is Act 3 over or not? Is this Act 4? And if it's Act 4, what is that going to look like? So I'm not saying that Russian policy is entirely dependent on what we do in the West. In fact, I've just spent 20 minutes explaining why it is that there are all of these domestic factors that drive Russian foreign policy. But there's no doubt that we can do quite a lot to affect what Russia does. And we have reason to do that, not because we need Russia as an ally. Russia is not an extremely powerful country that can help us solve global problems, but Russia can be a spoiler for anything that the United States wants to do. And that is a big problem for the United States. In fact, we find ourselves in the most Russian of situations, a duel. And as in a duel, if we're not careful, both sides will find themselves on the end of a bullet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I did not understand your reasoning about why Russia could never rise above the 2% level of world GDP, mainly because of their very high education level, their ability to manufacture things. They're very good at it. And I can't understand why they couldn't do what Germany did, for example, after the decimation of World War II, what they've done now with technology and their ability to organize work and labor. So why not Russia?
Okay, so let me start my answer with a question, which is, how many of you have bought something that says "Made in Russia" on the bottom? A couple. There are not many things out there to buy. And it's not because Russians are not educated and don't have the potential. One of the scholars that we have at the Davis Center, Lauren Graham, has written a fantastic book called Lonely Ideas that talks about all of the incredible discoveries made by Russian scientists. The radio, it wasn't Marconi who discovered it first. The laser, the light bulb, all of these things were first discovered by Russians. But Russians do not have a culture of commercialization of innovation. They develop science, but they have not got the institutional structure that encourages those scientists to commercialize their inventions, make money, and get rich. And without that, the inventions are then stagnating in Russia, and someone else from another country comes up with the same thing later and actually ends up being called the inventor and driving the economy someplace else. So that's one of the problems, is that Russia has always had incredible brains. And yet they have never been able to rely on manufactured goods. They have always been an exporter of raw materials. Why is that? One of the other problems is that since the Soviet Union collapsed, the governments have been talking about the need to restructure away from natural resources. But they have not set up the kind of institutions and rules that allow business people to actually create businesses that create money, that create goods, that sell things that can compete with oil and gas. Because whenever they start getting successful, either the state takes over what they've done, or you have a financial crisis and the head of Rosneft or the head of one of the oil companies comes to Putin and says, we really need $35 billion to bail us out. And they get it. And that's $35 billion that's not going to support nanotechnology or the universities or the commercialization of different inventions. So it's not that there's not the potential there, but Russia has never been able to figure out how to transform the economy into one that is actually equal to its intellectual potential.
Hi, good afternoon, ma'am. What do you take away from Russian novels and novelists in trying to understand Russian characters and foreign policy, like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, for example?
All right, that's a complicated question. And well, one of the things you can't help taking away is that Russians are really complicated, right? I mean, there is no easy way to understand Russian culture. In fact, there's a famous expression, umoy ni panyat, you just can't understand it with your mind. You have to feel it, you have to know it, you have to live it. And I think that one of the mistakes we make is that we think that things are very straightforward, that Russia wants X, and so they will do Y. And that's actually not how it works. So I would say that people who love Russian literature probably have a better understanding of what's happening in Russia today than people who have never read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. That being said, if we look at War and Peace, for example, I find the war sections much more interesting than the peace sections. The peace ones are kind of about social milieus and culture. But the war section and the idea that it's not about great men making history, but it's more about different trends, different directions, different movements that actually create world history is particularly intriguing when you think of the role that Putin has played in Russia. Right? So on the one hand, Tolstoy wrote War and Peace to show people that history is not about great men. He was speaking against a lot of the historians of the day. On the other hand, if you look at Russia today, there's virtually a cult of personality around Putin and about his importance. And you hear this expression, without Putin, there's no Russia. So I think it's the kind of ambiguity and complexity that makes it not only hard for us to understand, but I think it makes it hard sometimes for Russia to understand itself as well.
So my question is a bit ahead in the future. You mentioned oligarchs. I've always wondered what would happen once this generation of oligarchs sort of fades away, because eventually they'll get older, and newer oligarchs, presumably their offsprings would come into play. What would happen then?
So Russia is trying to cultivate a younger generation of elite. And I would say political elite, but political and economic elite are kind of the same thing right now. What's interesting is that, of course, the oligarchs have tried to position their children when possible, but they haven't really been the ones that are emerging as the strongest members of, say, the younger generation. What we see are people who are rising through the regions, particularly regional administrations, not the governor per se, but the deputy governor of a lot of regions. They are being cultivated by the Kremlin to be the next generation of political and economic elite. So it's a much more, in a way, it's a much more decentralized system in that the people who have power over different economic entities or different regional entities are being tasked with selecting people in their 40s to build up and kind of check. And if they appear worthy, then they are then promoted into positions of power. It's a very conscious movement right now because Putin does realize that his circle is aging and that that's a vulnerability. I would also point out that a lot of the protests now have involved young people, people who might not have even been born when Putin came to power in 2000. And this is a great source of anxiety for the Kremlin because these people have only known Putin and have only known kind of the success or the stability of the Putin years. And if they are fighting against it, then the regime needs to figure out a way to co-opt them into supporting what he's doing. The social contract is not working for them, and that's a great source of anxiety.
What advantage does Russia gain interfering with the United States elections?
So the first thing I would say is that the United States has been interfering in Russian elections for a long time. Starting in 1996, when basically the US decided that it was very important that the communists not return to power and that Yeltsin win, and that we were going to do everything we could to keep him in power. Now, I'm not judging that per se, but I'm saying that that is a reality that the Russians know well. So, to some extent, They accuse us of hypocrisy, of being so concerned with the Russians getting involved in our election. But let's look at the 2016 election in particular. What did Russia have to gain? They had a couple concerns. The first was that they really did not like Hillary Clinton. They were convinced, and these were intelligent people in think tanks, in universities, in the inner circles, they were convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to go to war with Russia if she won, because she hated Vladimir Putin. So there was this whole narrative that kind of starts in Kiev in 2004, continues in the second revolution in Kiev, where the United States hates Putin so much that they are willing to do a coup d'etat in Ukraine in order to put their person in power. And that's just so that they can gain a foothold to removing Putin. So a lot of what the Russians were trying to do was undermine Hillary and at least weaken her when she became president. I don't think anybody expected in Moscow for Trump to win. I don't think Trump expected to win, but certainly the Russians did not think that that was possible. And no one was more surprised than they were. Now, initially they were jubilant. I remember going to Moscow in December of 2016, and the Russians were so excited that finally things were going to move forward, and at least dialogue was going to restart. Dialogue had pretty much been completely shut off after 2014 and the invasion of Crimea. Now, my position on that is like Crimea was not a good thing, but completely closing all channels of communication with Russia is really stupid. When you need to know what's going on in another country and you want them to understand what's going on in your country, the solution is not to stop talking to them, even if you don't like them. We don't have to like them to talk to them. So the Russians soon became rather disillusioned when it became clear to them that Congress actually has a huge amount of power in the bilateral relationship, and particularly in the imposition of sanctions. So now they're in a position of not knowing exactly what can happen that would break the hold of Congress and of sanctions on the bilateral relationship, and they've pretty much given up on Trump and on whoever comes after Trump. One of the problems is that when you cut off channels of communication and you reduce fundings for things like military-to-military exchanges, it takes decades to build those back up again. And in the meantime, all of the networks and the relationships that had been created on both sides slowly fall apart. So now the Russians have a different goal, which is not so much to weaken Hillary Clinton or determine who's going to be the American president. I still don't think that they believe that they were responsible for that. But their project is to weaken Europe and to weaken the European Union, and to do that by supporting the far right. And so we see that in Italy, we see that in Germany, we saw that in Switzerland, we see that in their encouraging Brexit. Like for the Russians, the weaker Europe is, the stronger Russia looks in relation to Europe. It's all a question of relational importance. And so playing in the American election with Facebook or with Twitter feeds, or by exaggerating the impact of immigrants and giving Trump a little boost, all of that is really just kind of cheap thrills for the Russians. They do it because they're doing it everywhere. But it's not really part of a policy, and I'm pretty sure that it would stop from one day to the next if American policy changed. Now the question is, let's say American policy doesn't change. How do we deal with this Russian information attack, let's call it? And the fact is, there's nothing the Russians can give us or tell us that will make us feel secure, that will make us feel like our elections are secure, that if they say we're not going to hack your election systems, would anybody believe that? Of course not, right? Just like we wouldn't believe it if the Chinese said it. It's up to us to provide the kind of security for these systems and not to count on other countries being the good guys and not doing it.
Well, it seems like this is the unspoken elephant in the room tonight. What do you think of Trump's relationship with Russia?
All right, so the elephant first. Was there collusion or was there not collusion? I think the only thing we know for sure is that the Trump boys are idiots. They supposedly approached the Kremlin by sending emails asking for meetings, and the Kremlin just didn't even know what to do with this. It was so ridiculous. So I don't doubt that they might have been interested in getting this dirt from on Hillary Clinton from the Russians, but I don't think it happened. I do think, however, that Trump's long history of dealings with Russians and with Russian financial organizations and people is, in fact, a serious issue. That for many years, when he could not get loans from American banks because he had gone bankrupt, he was getting money from Russian banks. And those Russian banks would have informed the Kremlin at some point that, in fact, they had been supporting Trump's operation. So it might not be blackmail per se, but there's definitely a relationship there that Trump does not want to have out in the open, or we would have heard about it already.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you could speak to what relation or what relevance you think the idea of the Orthodox Commonwealth might still have in Russian foreign policy, and if so, if it's pursued more as an actual end or as a means toward a more pragmatic idea.
So the second question, yes, the Orthodox Commonwealth, also known as Ruski Mir, or the Russian world, was an effort that was launched probably about mid-2000s to use the power of Russian speakers and the Orthodox Church and the idea of a common culture to unify Russians that were not living in Russia. So one of the tragedies for Russia is that the population is now so small compared to what it used to be in the Soviet Union, and there were many Russians that were left outside of its borders when the Soviet Union collapsed. They are still Russian speakers, many of them are still Orthodox, but they are not part of the Russian state per se. And Ruski Mir was an attempt for them to feel that they were in fact still part of Russia. What we've seen is that the effort kind of has collapsed since it didn't work in Ukraine. Right? In fact, Russia is kind of working at odds in Ukraine because now they're fighting their Orthodox brothers in Ukraine. And what's this about Ruski Mir anyway? Like, how does these two things fit together? They don't. And so what we've seen is a gradual kind of hushing of that effort. I think there's still Ruski Mir foundations in quite a few places, but many of them have closed.
Would you comment on the size of Russia's nuclear armaments and any threat that it poses?
It's a threat. Like that story or that line about radioactive ash is actually not a joke. Russia still has an enormous nuclear arsenal. And in fact, because they worry about NATO on its borders and because they worry about their conventional strength, for them, the nuclear deterrent is actually the foundation of their military strategy. The thing that's particularly concerning is that the arms control agreements that we have are all expiring, and no action is being taken to put new ones in place. So if there's one big crisis coming up in US-Russia relations that we need to deal with, it's arms control. And we did it with the Soviets, who were our mortal enemies, so surely we can find a way to do it with the Russians. We have to do it. And that is really a problem. I was in DC 6 months ago on the Hill, and even on the Hill they know that it's a problem. But no one is going to bring up arms control in Congress when the Mueller investigation is bringing up all of this information about how nasty the Russians are. From my point of view, it doesn't matter if they're nasty or they're not nasty. They still have nuclear weapons, and we still need arms control to contain them.
My question has to do with we watched the Russians build up militarily over 40-plus years after World War II, then collapse. Percentage of GDP during that period used for military hardware versus today, where did that money go?
I'm sorry, where?
The fact that they're not building the ships, the submarines.
What are they spending the money on instead?
Well, it appears they're sending it on
Okay.
computers and internet time.
Okay. In terms of the money and what the Russians spend money on now, the Russian budget is pretty small, right? Remember when it was the Soviet Union, they had a lot more resources and a lot more funds coming in. Now the amount that they spend as a percentage of GDP is minuscule compared to what the US spends, as a percentage, not even in real dollars. I think that it's, if you look at the breakdown of where the money is going, none of it is particularly inspiring. There's some on pensions, there's some on social programs, there's some on infrastructure. They spent $5 billion from the regional budgets to build the huge bridge to Kerch to connect Crimea with the Russian mainland. And Crimea has actually turned out to be a huge financial sinkhole for Russia. So I think if you said right now, where is the money that's coming in from the fact that oil prices have slightly improved, I would say most of it is being sunk into Crimea. It's interesting that some of it is going into modernization, to military modernization, but not that much. And in fact, you see Russia is doing things like cyber attacks because they're extremely cheap, right? It costs nothing, really, to do that. So if they can continue to cause great aggravation and problems using cyber warfare, I'm sure they're going to continue to do that. At the same time, there was a modernization program that Putin launched in the early 2000s when there was more money. And people say that one of the reasons they launched their airstrikes in Syria was to show off the military hardware to potential buyers in the third world and to show that they really had some fancy new equipment to sell.
Very different topic, but gets back to youth in Russia. During the early 90s, there was an influx of democratization efforts and welcomed by Russia, particularly in the more liberal regions like the Samara region. I'm interested in knowing what the legacy of that, especially working in education with teachers and students, and whether that's been co-opted now by organizations like Nashi and others.
Let's say you were 20 years old when you came of age in 1990, right, when the Soviet Union collapsed. That means you're about 50 years old right now. And one of the things you're worried about is the fact that the pension age for women is now going to be raised from 50 to 55. If you're a woman. If you're a man, it's being raised from 60 to 65. Sorry? For women, sorry, thank you, that's right. So that is a big concern. I would say that there is a legacy in terms of people's ability to travel and their eagerness to see the world. You see Russian tourists pretty much everywhere now where you go. But I think the 1990s were really a very difficult and kind of bitter time. Not perhaps to the extent that Putin says they were, because that's part of the narrative and that's part of the justification for his popularity. But a lot of those teenagers had parents who lost their jobs or who went to their jobs and weren't getting paid, or who were getting paid in barter rather than getting paid in cash. And so while they have perhaps been able to take advantage of things like travel, and perhaps they had some education abroad, I don't think that that's made a significant difference in the long term.
What does the future hold for Ukraine, since they did massacred a lot of people and sent refugees flowing out? Now they got Crimea, and also with Syria, do you think, with the Russian interventions?
Okay, so I'm not a Middle East expert. I can't say what's going to happen in Syria, although it looks pretty bad from here. But I can talk about Ukraine. Ukraine has some extremely serious problems. One of them is corruption. It's been a problem in Ukraine since the early 90s, and it hasn't gotten fixed. And there appears to be such deep and pervasive state capture there of the oligarchs, of the state apparatus, that the prospects for genuine reform appear to be severely crimped. It's not impossible. There are a lot of young people, educated young people, really trying to do their best, but there doesn't seem to be a willingness to take some of the very difficult steps that have to be taken. For example, to have a really independent judiciary. At the same time, if you go to Kiev, people tell you, look, we're at war. Our east is occupied, so it's not just a question of Crimea, which for all intents and purposes is gone. But the problem is that the eastern part of Ukraine is occupied by separatists being supported by Russia. And so Ukraine is fighting a war for this territory, even if it's not an everyday shooting war. And that makes it very difficult to then concentrate on economic restructuring and the type of reforms that have to happen. It's interesting because in some ways the population seems to be more agile and I'd say democratically oriented than what we see in Russia. So whereas in Russia you have some of the same problems, you don't really see the same desperate impetus for reform. And I think that in some ways the fact that Russia got involved in Ukraine has accelerated Ukraine's movement towards wanting to be different from Russia and wanting to be different from their past. But the obstacles are so great and the economy is such a disaster. I mean, one of the reasons that Russia hasn't actually taken over eastern Ukraine is that they don't want it. It's an economic disaster. It has coal plants that have to be closed. It's kind of a deindustrialized wasteland. And they don't want it, but it also means that if the Ukrainians had it, they would have to do something for those people and those populations, and they barely have the money to take care of the people they have on the other side of the border.
There was never actually a promise given to Russia that NATO would not be expanded. And the fact that Putin has been able to get so much traffic out of referring to a promise that was never made is really remarkable.